Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The moment I received it from the president of the court, I said to myself, this is the ending of my career.
Coming up, the story of the judge and the general. I talk with Judge Juan Guzman, who indicted the former dictator of Chile, General Augusto Pinochet, for murder and kidnapping. In doing so, he not only changed his country, but set a precedent for human rights cases around the world. Learn more on Dialogue next. Stay tuned.
Here in my hands, I have the report by the experts that examined the rails. It's very easy to see that that is a button. So we have the impression that that was a piece of rail where a human being was attached to. I knew lots of human nature through literature, but I had never been face to face with so much evil.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. You were just watching a clip from The Judge and the General, an award-winning PBS documentary that chronicles the fascinating transformation of Chilean Judge Juan Guzman. In 1998, Judge Guzman was assigned to investigate a criminal complaint filed by the relatives of people who had disappeared during the brutal dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. No one expected Guzman, a conservative judge from the same social strata as Pinochet, to take a tough stance. As he delved into the claims, though, he would come to understand how serious they were. Judge Guzman would go on to indict General Pinochet for murder and kidnapping, as well as indict hundreds of his agents. The investigations, he would say, opened the eyes of my soul. And here to talk more about this seminal case and how it affected international law is Judge Juan Guzman. Welcome. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
Now, one note, Judge Guzman is the keynote speaker for the annual Sherman Bellwood Memorial Lecture at the University of Idaho Law School, and I thank the organizers of that event for finding time in his schedule for this interview. Well, let's set the stage, the scene for people. September 11th, 1973, known to some Chileans as another 9/11, a different 9/11 because of what happened after that. There was a coup. There was a coup against the then head of Chile, Allende, by General Augusto Pinochet. This coup was supported by our government, the United States government, and it was also supported by you and your friends and your family. What was happening in the country that you were happy to see this coup occur?
We were sick to begin with, because if we had known before what a coup meant and what a dictatorship, a military dictatorship went, we would have been absolutely against it. Unfortunately, there was lack of products. You went to the stores to get, we had a baby that was 2 years old. You went to the stores to buy milk or wheat or whatever you needed for the baby, and there was absolutely nothing. I was judge at the south of the country in a place called Panguipulli, Land of Lions, and every 2 weeks I took 2 suitcases full of meat, wheat, milk, whatever I could get, because in Santiago, where we were living, you couldn't find anything at all.
So the economy was very poor.
It was very poor.
People were upset. The government was communist.
That's
and
right.
There was a fear, or socialist. Socialist. There was a fear, though, of communism. Our President Nixon was very concerned that there'd be what's called in the film a communist sandwich.
That's right.
That there, with Cuba and then Chile, that this was encroaching. It was a post-Cold War fear. So this coup happened, and General Pinochet came in, and you all celebrated, yes?
That's true. That is one of the shames I've had in my life. We did celebrate it honestly, and at the night when we heard the sound of guns, I even said to myself, "Whoa, another communist left." We even turned to think in that unhuman way that made us be for the coup. But it didn't last long because, first of all, the coup, according to what we thought or what we expected, was going to have us have a period for preparing ourselves to another election and to have a democratic elected president. But that never happened. We had Pinochet over 17 years, and really it was too much for the people, too much for the country.
And almost immediately people began disappearing and were murdered, dissidents, but people weren't necessarily alarmed. I'd like to show a clip from the documentary The Judge and the General that I think gets to this issue.
There, I saw photographs of people that had been shot by soldiers. I thought honestly that they were isolated cases, powerful bullies who went out in the street and just did things on their own. We couldn't believe that an honorable army as ours could be involved in such kind of crimes. We thought, frankly, that this was communist propaganda. At the beginning, we were not close to the people who were suffering. Most of the people were the relatives of young women and young men who were students mostly, and they had the sorrow they were feeling too near. For us, it was something that was far, but as I was a judge, I had obtained access to photographs as the ones that we saw a few seconds ago. And there I started realizing that something fishy was going on.
Well, let's flash forward to 1998. As you mentioned, Augusto Pinochet was in power for 17 years, and then after that, people were filing claims. You were assigned by lottery
Yes.
to this massive case of looking at, what, maybe 1,000, more than that, claims?
More than 200 claims.
And then,
Yes.
so you did not want this case.
Oh, I had to accept it.
But it's not something that you really were looking forward to.
No, not at all.
Would be a mark in some ways.
Well, I'll tell you, it's what we call in Chile a hot potato. You know, something.
Here in Idaho, too.
Really? And well, I received this hot potato, and the moment I received it from the president of the court, I said to myself, this is the ending of my career. But that's not true. I realized afterwards that I had the fortune of having been appointed in this case, because as I say it in the film, this gave me the opportunity of being with the real people, with the real Chileans, with the Chilean people who suffer, who have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to work and to take a bus for 2 hours sometimes a day. And I mean, it made me feel one of the people I had never felt before.
As you say, that prior to that, you kind of been in a golden bubble.
That's right. That's right. The life I had really, we were never rich. We were far from being rich, but I was the son of a diplomat, and that makes you have the illusion that you're rich. You buy cars without taxes. You live in buildings or houses that normally you could not afford. And well, that and the schools where I went, the university also, Catholic University in Santiago, that kept me in another world, in a bubble, where I didn't know what was happening really.
In doing these investigations, you had to go places that were dangerous, uncomfortable.
Yes.
You went down into open, old abandoned mines to look for bones. You exhumed graves. Skeletons were examined to see how the person really died versus the story. There were even searches in the water.
That's right.
For bodies that had been pushed out of helicopters, tied to rails. And people were reporting that they were still seeing these rails down below. This is very disturbing kind of evidence. Well, we showed actually a clip at the top of that investigation where you found a button on a rail, and that proved that there had been a body down there.
Yes.
How did you keep your mental, emotional, spiritual life together while you were finding these things?
It's a difficult question because one could think that judges don't have sensibility. The truth is, in a moment, you acquire something like harder skin that may prevent you from realizing the depth of what you're really studying, of what you're really investigating. At the same time, there's the fatigue, the great tiresome. You feel tired every day. It's like having ran 1,000 meters. So no, really, I don't want to look like a hero, but I did have as only compliment some pills that made me sleep a little. But besides all that, I felt that this was the sort of job I had to do in a certain moment.
It was dangerous too. Well, you had bodyguards, yes, for yourself, for your family?
I had many bodyguards. I had bodyguards during the day, at nighttime, in cars around my house. My 2 daughters had bodyguards. My wife never accepted a bodyguard, but we were in danger, at least.
Were you afraid?
Well, I also had that sensation of having to have integrity. I have an example. I was a young boxer when I was 15, 16 years old, and it happens that when you are boxing, you're not afraid. Perhaps after, and if you know you have to fight with the guy that's better than you, certainly you're afraid, but at the moment you're fighting, you're not afraid. I had the sensation of having that protection also.
Now, we don't have time, unfortunately, to go into all the details of the case. I encourage people to watch the film, The Judge and the General, and we'll also have some links online to a PBS, to other works about this. But ultimately, you, well, first of all, you got a chance to talk to General Pinochet.
That's right, yes.
What was, I can't imagine, what was that like?
Well,
I mean, it's probably very gentlemanly.
Yes.
In the beginning, because you're both from the same, or similar backgrounds.
We're even from the same family. It's incredible.
Really?
Really. But we're descendants from soldiers that came to Chile in 1725 after having fought during generations the war against the Boers in Europe. So then we are from the same family, but very, very separated in generations.
So when you met him, though, it was maybe cordial at first?
Sure.
Your next conversation, though, would not go as well.
Not as well.
You were trying to interrogate him.
I did interrogate him, and I got a good interrogation from him. He recognized having written over a document that explained how 75 people had been shot in the north and in the south of Chile due to his indications. Naturally, he changed the story, but if you had the paper, if you had the people that had died, if you had the people who gave orders to shoot all those people, all those people, you realized that there was a direct order, that there was a first order that had to be given by him. I had two decisions to make. One decision to decide over his mental faculties.
Right.
And there, perhaps I committed the mistake of saying not guilty, but what I wanted to say was that he would not be responsible at this moment because he was considered that he had a dementia. And then that I had the other decision that I had to make if he was considered to be able mentally. The truth was that I had done these two handwritings, these two projects of decisions, and when I did the first one, I was convinced that he was mentally unfit. But afterwards, I saw an interview with a lady, a journalist from
Miami.
And I got absolutely convinced that all he said and how he said it, that he was much more sane than I was.
It's an extraordinary interview, really.
It was an extraordinary interview. And then that's when I did the second decision on the same issue, that he was absolutely, how do you say, responsible of his actions.
Well, it was an incredible moment when you were filmed with all of the TV cameras around you and the relatives of victims waiting to hear your decision as to whether he could be indicted. Let's take a look at a clip from the judge and the general of that time period.
Se le somete a proceso como autor de 9 secuestros permanentes y de un homicidio calificado.
¿Él ordenó la detención? ¿Está ordenada la detención, señor ministro?
Está ordenada la detención y su permanencia en prisión domiciliaria. Sí.
Tranquila, Rosita, tranquila.
Ahí, espera.
I am happy to have been appointed judge to this case, to have suffered with the ones who suffered, and to become one more of the people here. Not a man that saw the people sitting from a higher chair or from a higher place.
I've watched that clip many times, I'm sure you have, and I get kind of goosebumps when I watch it, when I see the emotion of the woman crying. So many people were waiting for that decision.
Yes. That woman, her father was kidnapped and disappeared. And that's the worst pain a human being can suffer, you know, the disappearance of their family.
Now, it's interesting because the filmmaker then follows up with another scene of Manuel Contreras, who is the head of DINA, being arrested, and his family's screaming just the same.
Exactly,
you see the split in your society between the people who were victimized and the people who just cannot believe that this even occurred. Does that split still live on in your country?
Unfortunately, yes, it does. At that moment, we could say that it was 50-50, a little bit more sometimes, a little bit less some others. But today, I would say there's a good 20% that stands faithfully for Pinochet and his government.
Ultimately, General Pinochet did not go on trial.
Yes.
He was under house arrest, and he died under house arrest at the age of 91 or something like that,
That's
1991.
right. Yes.
So does that mean it wasn't a success because he never came to
Thank you for that question.
trial?
Yes, I think it was not a failure for us, for the judges, nor for the country. I think that this case helped the people, the Chilean people, and many people in the world, to realize that there had been horrible crimes, and just having had the opportunity to show all the things that the Chilean army, navy, police, and air, I'd say, and soldiers of the air, I'm sorry.
Air Force.
Air Force. Well, once we had these trials, we have had more than 1,100
Convictions. These are of his agents and other people who carried out the orders.
That's right. And then we proved the world, and especially we proved Chile, that what was thought that happened really happened, that it was not a joke, that there was an incredible quantity of people killed. More than 3,000 people killed. Today we still have 1,200 disappeared, and we have much more than 250 people tortured. So what more? It's impossible. You could have more, but it's not good to have one person victimized as the way they were victimized in Chile.
And some reparations have been paid?
Yes, but slight reparations. Let's say if a person lost somebody of his family, I'm going to tell you 250, $600 a month. Mm. It's good in the sense that it's better than nothing. We're poor people. It's a poor country. It's a poor society. But it doesn't compare to the suffering they had.
How did this case affect international human rights law or human rights laws? What do you think its legacy is in that arena?
Well, in Chile it's very important because people like me, I think, are going to think in a future we're never going to have a coup, never, because we know what it is today. But in a legal aspect, the judges and I, who worked these cases, gave a title to a crime that did not exist in Chile. It was the kidnapping, the permanent kidnapping of people. But the idea is that we established that those people who had disappeared were kidnapped up to the date of the indictment, or up to the date of the accusation, or after the day, up to the date of finding those people, the defendants, guilty of committing those crimes. That was a new point of view that we developed. Yes.
That really was a new way of litigating these crimes.
That's right.
Our government was involved. There's plenty of research, and the papers have been opened up to the public, including cables, to see what was going on between the two governments. Do you think that people in our government should have been held accountable?
Yes, I do. Yes. For example, Mr. Kissinger, I am absolutely sure that he could have been considered accountable also.
In what respect? What do you think, that he should have been put on trial?
Yes, at least to prove a trial is good, either to convict a person or to declare him innocent. For both things, I think it would have been better for him. He knew what was happening. He had connection with people in the States that knew what was happening moment after moment. And in a certain way, he was following the indications of President Nixon that was wanting to have an open war towards all sorts of communism in Latin America.
Judge, why should people here in the United States, here in Idaho, care about a case like this, a situation like this in Chile that happened in the 1970s and 80s?
Yes. It's a difficult question, but I think it's good to know what really happened in a country under a dictatorship, to be more open to the people in the world. There's lots of persecution, there's lots of difficulties for the people to go to the countries where they could feel free and not persecuted, that I think that it's good to, it makes our soul be softer, kinder perhaps. In that sense, I think it's good.
And to be aware in your own country of what's happening?
And to be aware in our own country in order to not have this happen again. No, the Argentinian people have made a slogan, nevermore. And I think that nevermore has to operate for all of the people of the world. Unfortunately, the world continues to have so many problems that cause these situations, unfortunately.
Is there a lesson in your transformation as well, as a person who was living in a golden bubble, to seeing the truth?
Yes, it is. It is. I feel more a human being. Before, I was just mentally a young man.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing this time with us and your experiences. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the beautiful questions and the opportunity you have given me to explain such a difficult part of my life.
I hope you have a good rest of your trip to Idaho. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. You've been listening to Juan Guzman, a former judge from Chile who indicted General Augusto Pinochet and his agents for murder. To learn more about the cases and the film The Judge and the General, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.